Mr. Manuel,
Mr. Manuel.
fearless
Um,
leader.
I am totally prepared. I know exactly what to do.
That's the
So,
that's been this whole journey for everybody. I think
so yeah, I actually have some insights, but they're not really related to the text that we supposed to be preparing. Because what I did is I listened to it, and it could not capture me at all. It was all like,
Hmm.
yeah, I didn't have a way to relate. So let's uh, let's make that my intention for today. Find a way to relate to this craziness. So yeah, about last time, um, I think we kind of went into a whole bunch of topics uh, that are going to be further explored later on. Um, all these categories that seem to be introduced, and I chapter 3 is also a lot of introduction of framework later going to be appealed to. So there's the the trying to establish a grounding from which to argue from. Um, so yeah, let's see if I can tell how my week was formed by our our last talk. I did have a lot of thinking about uh, how I should engage with the reading or reading as such. I had a lot of insights around um, this idea of when when you relate to a word, right? Like it can open up a relationship. It can open up um, a connection to your phenomenological experience. And I had the example of mourning there, and that that is in some sense not a natural reaction for me, but I also think that is true for modern man, uh, where where we live in this disconnected state. And one of the realizations was that even though I knew this, um, and I can have that attitude or that thought while reading, that doesn't resolve the issue. So yeah, I think that was actually a really important insight that I had. Yeah, so I would invite Ethan to do his reflection and set his intentions for this week.
Um, well, my intentions are to understand the world better and thus participate in it better. I understand that might be frustrating because it's very vague, I guess. But I don't. Yeah, understand the world better, and thus my participation in it better.
I'll point at the next person.
Oh, I get to choose the next person. Okay, let's go with William. If no William, we'll go with Mark.
Oh, okay. Yeah, William doesn't love us anymore. Maybe he'll come back before I'm done. Yeah, I mean, it was last last week. I've been noticing, we'll say, the misuse of what I read called the Republic by many people. Apparently, missed the point of book two entirely. I don't know if they skipped over the words or what's going on, but very clear. You can see people casting justice incorrectly, even though it's right in book two. You can see them missing the points of these things. Uh, you can tell when people have read some of the book and not all of it, or didn't comprehend all of it. So I've been noticing that, which is one of the reasons why I haven't read the book up until now, because I had a feeling that if I read it, I, I would understand things and get angry at people for not understanding things that are kind of right there in the text. And my intent going forward here is to get some sort of understanding for whether or not book three is merely about the reflection of a perfect uh, engagement, or if there's more going on within the within that particular text, because it's not like book two, right? There's some drastic changes from the attitude of book two. So yeah, that's my intent. So scared off William. So it's Danny's turn.
Um, well, from what Manuel said about how words open up relationships, I had the opposite experience with book three in that I resonated very, very strongly with very much of the content. So maybe hopefully I can compensate for Manuel's lack of resonance. But I feel that the concepts in book three were much closer to the primitives of life in lieu of missing the point of the book. I just had this idea like 2 seconds ago, but I think that this is the chapter where you're forced to confront final cause for the first time. And so kind of my relationship with the book was in reading book three, kind of having to think deeply about like what am I willing to go all in on and all in for. That's kind of where it led me. I think the way that the poetry, the music, the art, and the gymnastic, and the relationship between all these concepts, they seem to be all framed by the image of the gods and this imitative and mimetic. You know, if to me, book three read as though it's supposed to, when you have the top down full on tyranny thing, it's intended to lead to this absurd clown world where and I think you're supposed to get this sense, which demonstrates the importance of the poetic, right? To me, chapter three felt very strongly symbolic, and so like kind of basically how feeling out like how do you ground out what's important in life? How do you actually I mean, there's a lot of discernment, a lot of discernment in chapter three or book three. Um, so it felt to me as though it was headed towards like final cause, pointing in that direction. Um, so that's where my intentive in my intent and meditations I think are primarily oriented towards, is thinking about what are those things. And I mean I have answers to that varying degrees of resolution, but I'll leave my intent at that.
So can you point at your understanding of final cause and how it relates to?
Well, they get
The
into
book?
this in book 4 and I think 8. Um, okay, it's a good question. It's a hard one. I think it's kind of pushing my limits to do so right now, at least off the top of my head. But different they talk about how like different spirit, like the spirit of ferocity is necessary for the soldier, but maybe not so much for the musician, right? So like there, different spirits are adequate for different roles. And so thinking about like, well, what is my role in this life, and what is my role in my life, and in my influence to other people? What role do I play to them? What do I stand for? What am I an image of? And if the image of the gods define the virtues of the state and therefore provide justification for the action of humans, like that all starts with, you have to start with the image of the gods, you know. So that's kind of what I mean. It's like the final cause could be one many, but Not infinitely many, but a closed set of many. But it depends upon it depends upon it just being aware of like your starting points. No, I do have an answer. I don't want to really get into that, especially not live. More personal spin up, take of that. Like I mean, I could give an example of the role that I think that I play in some people's lives, right? So this book kind of helps me to reason about that a little bit.
So the thing that I think they're really adamant about in the book is that you can only have one role. And when you do two roles, like you're imitating being able to do either, and you're doing none. I don't know about that. Like I get that there's this mastery that you can get to, right? And then that you at a certain point you can get to this, I don't know, this space that is unattainable to other people. And I think they're implying that there's a necessity for that or something. Like I go to this idea of the Eastern thought, right, where they have these hobbies or something, where yourself in the hobby or whatever. But I don't even think they're that extreme over there. So just your education is supposed to involve sports and music. So like, are we like? I'm a little bit confused about the messaging that they're giving in the book.
Mark, what do you have to say about that? A
Yeah,
mixture
well,
of.
look, yeah, it's certainly I can see where people get the single identity thing out of this, and this is what I was saying earlier, right? Like, are these merely what would you call methods of reasoning for the sake of reasoning something through? Because some of the statements are obviously absurd, right? And they're fighting with the poets for no good reason, as near as I can tell, right? And their idea in here is very much about the perfect image of X would be corrupted by Y, and therefore we can't have Y. That's the formula throughout the book, right? Um, and, to the earlier point, by way of the gods are perfect and therefore. So the problem with all that is that the Greeks didn't believe the gods were perfect. Like that were in the myths,
You're
zero,
starting
right?
to.
The gods are meant to exemplify the imperfection of man, not the other way around. And so, unlike, we'll say, modern religious traditions, where we use the ideal to contrast us, they were using the super being to contrast the imperfection of humans. So that's a different approach. So why they're taking the approach of the perfection of the gods while at the same time excoriating the poets is, I mean, that's absurd. Like they only have access to the gods through the poets.
Mhm. It, we're starting. Well, this is the monotheism coming to light. I wrote this down. Um, People will begin to execute their own evil acts when they believe that such things are being done by relative. They believe such things are being done by relatives of Zeus, whose paternal altar is in the heavens and on the Mount of Ida. So there's a weird thing going on. Yeah, like that's what I was wondering last week or whenever it was. Like, so they're um, removing something from the gods and putting them on man. The morality or justice, I guess we could put it that way.
Mhm.
What is weird though is how are they able to see that? Like how are they able to remove this and put it on the man? How do they see that? How are they able to see that the gods are unjust? But
Well, and I don't think that they're trying to make that move. This is very much a rhetorical uh, exploration and not a set of claims. And I think that's where people get
Hmm.
confused
Yeah.
about the whole book, The Republic. Like they think there are claims in here, but that's not what they're doing at all. Explicitly, they're not unclear about this. And the absurdity of Socrates, especially in book 3, where he's just making statements and getting agreement.
Hmm.
This is like people don't act like that ever. That never happens. There's always back and forth. If you want to see back and forth, you can watch my live stream last night. There was tons of back and forth, right? There wasn't this, I'm going to make a statement and the other person's just going to agree. And I don't see anything other than that. There's zero pushback from the other characters. It really is just an exaltation of Socrates in his glorious method. Um, Leading somebody to a particular place for a particular reason without any presupposition or justification. Oh, like, I'm
Right.
not
There's a lot of
opposed.
things. There's a lot of things taken for granted. They're starting that
Right.
like Danny was saying, like we're starting to see final cause come, which is goodness, something that's transcendent of all of these gods, and like, well, we can't have the gods do this because that's evil, and they're like, yeah, it's like, okay, we missed something, like we missed something there. It's like, how do you know that's evil? You know, how do you know that there's a deprivation of goodness there?
Well, we didn't miss it. It's not here. It's in their religion. It's just
Right.
that
Okay.
this is the philosophy, and yeah. So one of the channels I've been engaging with is called Esoterica, and in there he starts talking about, here's the philosophers. Oh, but by the way, here's their tradition that we would call religious. And so there is no philosophy without religion anywhere. That just isn't a thing. And this is what we're missing. They're not talking about the religious part because it's taken for granted. It's already assumed to be there. We're ignoring that fact, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, but I'm going to disagree. First of all, they're referencing the myths a lot, right? And then secondly, um, they do give definitions, right? Like we went over this the other day, right? Where there's good in a good knife, right? And then there's good within the social context, right? And then there's good in relationship to the gods, and so there are three different goods, and they're in
Yeah,
some
but they don't
translations they
define
seem. Hmm?
they don't define them. They just say they exist. It's like, okay, sure, there's three aspects of the good.
Right, right. Well, yeah, they. Well, I don't know if they don't define them, but at least not sufficiently. But yeah, they'll get into it in book 4, and like there's some talk about the good. They're yeah, they're making some interesting claims, and we'll hotly debate those when we get to it. But also, like I don't think you need to know the good in order to call out evil. Like that's I think that's also a fallacy.
Well, can you can you
I didn't
expound
hear the
on that?
disagreement. Yeah, where's the disagreement?
Can you expound? How can you know? How can you call out evil without having some understanding or disposition towards goodness?
Well, they go into that in book 4 as well, right? Where there's well, they're calling them opposites, but like I don't think goodness and evil are necessarily opposites. Like they're looking in different directions. But so if you look in one direction, you can say, well, this is in that direction, and that direction is not good. But that doesn't mean that you know what the good direction is. Like it just means that you have discernment about directions that aren't good.
Yeah,
Okay,
that to me is a problem, right? This is the Sam Harris problem. It's the direction problem.
I guess you could.
Because there's always a way to look where there's nothing but more evil. And that's the problem I think that Ethan's pointing to, is that you still need a definition by which to judge.
Um. So okay, this actually
But
makes
but
sense
I
to me.
think I think this book is actually about making that definition, because I think justice is enacting the good or something. I think that's the definition of justice, kind of.
If you see something in the world and its telos is located within itself, in that aspect, you don't need. I mean, you actually do have a concept of the good, knowing that goodness is transcendent. Like you do need that. You can look anywhere and you can see if something's telos is located within itself, it's just going to consume the entire world, and you can call that out evil. I get that, like you don't know what the good is, but you actually do know what the good is. The good is something transcendent that doesn't point towards itself. So, anyways,
Yeah. I Look, I mean, you can make a case for justice being linked to the good, but you can't reduce the good to justice. In the same way, you can't reduce politics to justice, which is what people seem to have done with this book somehow. The politics is a much smaller bucket, and there's no politics in the Republic. If that's what you read, you misread the book. You need to go back and figure it out, because you've missed a bunch of framing or words or both. I don't know. It's not there
ages.
though. Pages, whole. Just skip book two. I don't. They're explicit about what they're doing. So it's puzzling that people would say they're doing this when they explicitly say we're not doing that, we are doing this, right? They're not trying to solve the grand problem of the best city. They're only trying to solve the problem of what is justice. And justice is only one aspect of politics. Like in the US in particular, everybody should know this. The justice system is one of three branches. So you can't reduce the government to the courts. Doesn't make any sense.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I'm kind of jumping to the end of the book, but I guess the one of the reasons I like the book is because they it's pretty primitive in that they talk about how the harmonious soul is both temperate and courageous. So they have some of these themes like temperance and what was the other one? I don't remember. But like, basically how like if you have too much gym, you become too hard. If you have too much music, you become too effeminate. Um, and how um, the way to kind of navigate whether you're doing well in your role is dependent upon like your aim. I think maybe. And like the
Oh,
judge, like for
tell us.
example, the good physician, maybe he doesn't need to have he needs to actually like be sickly himself. So maybe the best physician needs to have firsthand experience with his art, but maybe the judge, you don't want to have firsthand experience, because then he doesn't have a pattern of honesty. And there, so that's what kind of what I found was interesting, is that thinking about justice, or is justice enacting the good? I don't know. That's complicated. I don't know if I'm smart enough to figure that out. But I can maybe feel into whether something is harmonious or not with respect to some spirit. Like if this
Right.
spirit's excellent or not. Like I think that I can tell, I can sense, I can discern whether or not this is can integrate it in with the rest of life, you know?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I don't need to
Well,
be
and that's
concerned with this other abstraction personally.
exactly, Danny. And that's right. You don't need to know. It's not required. Right? You can feel your way into goodness. It's not required that you know things to get to the good. The more things you know, the less likely you are to be able to get to the good, because it's going to be too muddled. Right? There's too much information in your way. And I think that the purpose of book three is to set up the rhetorical framework that demonstrates that this mode of this is perfection, here's how it's not met, and therefore we have to delete these things, can't work in the world. It's not a way that we can live. It's not an option that's available to us. We have to deal with the ambiguity. We have to deal with the conflict. We have to deal with the fact that there isn't a perfect standard. And if there was a perfect standard, we couldn't have any of the richness of life that we require. In other words, perfection kills life. And I think that, I mean, that's in the scientific literature too, incidentally. Um,
Yeah, you can't
And
see
there's a
God's
great
face and live.
uh, that's not the only place it is. It's in the scientific literature too. But that's the key, is that these seeming conflicts are the thing that we need to be able to balance out in some sense, accept in some other sense. And when we're not thinking about that, when we're not able to engage with that correctly, then we have a different set of problems. And that set of problems is unresolvable. And that, I think, is what at least he's setting up in book three to, to highlight, is that life ain't easy. These things don't have simple answers. And trying to make them simple destroys everything. And that means you don't need to know these things. So there's a wonderful movie called The Doctor with William Hurt, and it's very much about being a doctor. And the guy's a jerk. He's a total jerk in the beginning of the movie, and then he gets sick, and now he has to have people take care of him, and they don't do a great job because he was a jerk. And then he comes out of that with bedside manner and becomes a decent human. And why is that though? Right, that is because he's following this pattern of knowledge first. You go to med school, get all, you can be efficient, right? Knowledge is great. You can be efficient with knowledge. You can be really efficient with knowledge, right? But you lose all the flavor of the emotional engagement of life, right? The caring, the kindness, right? Those things all get thrown out the window. They're inefficient. They are inefficient. You can't make them efficient. They aren't part of efficiency, right? And that's very much what book three is talking about. It's like, well, can't allow the poets because we can't allow this aspect of poetry and that aspect of poetry, and we have to get rid of the poets. There's no alternative. What would your life be without poetry? Come on, right? So it's setting up that whole thing. Like, you can be a better doctor by being less efficient and more caring, right? You can have a better society by accepting some of these other components that, if they had to be perfect, you couldn't have.
Mhm.
Should we? Right now, we're kind of talking about the whole chapter, kind of in a broad brush. Should we maybe try to maybe walk through it a little bit?
Have notes? Does somebody have notes?
I yeah,
We'll walk
I
through.
have some. They're not great, but I guess my also, I was weakest on the early part too. But I'll just maybe I'll do a quick breadth first overview from my perspective, and they talk first about poetry and the gods, and then they talk about music and gymnastic and art and gymnastics, and then they kind of start to maybe kind of combine some of the things at the end. But so starting off with poetry, um, I guess from my take, Socrates portrays the gods as capricious, cruel, and petty, um, like Mark said, and therefore we have to cut a bunch of stuff out. But one of the first things that they do downstream from, like for example, they give the example of Odysseus meeting Achilles in the underworld, and Achilles tells Odysseus he'd rather be a serf on the land of the poor than rule over all the dead. And Socrates argues that this will cultivate fear of death in the minds of the young men who read the Odyssey. So what this society wants, people who will choose death in battle, rather than defeat and slavery. And so if that's what we want, that kind of informs the type of poetry that we want to allow. So they kind of first start off on this topic of imitation or the mimetic arts. Um, if you have the gods that exemplify a certain set of virtues, then you're gonna create people with habit patterns that you may or may not like. Um, then so that's kind of my high level take of the first topic of poetry, and then that kind of leads into the topic of music, which I found interesting.
Let's
Hmm.
discuss the poetry
Okay.
first. Um, so the thing that I got out of that piece, and that's almost everything I actually read and didn't listen to, is that they're pursuing truth. So, so they're talking about this imitation stuff or mimicry or whatever, right? Which which is a distortion of truth, right? Like you're giving a false signal to people. Um, and so I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to purify um, the everything effectively, right? They're trying to get a purity, right? Like okay, like does this allow you to be in right relationship? Well, if it does, then it's okay. But if it doesn't, then we should get rid of it. And then they're fairly ambiguous about how to supplant it, and also ambiguous about how to deal with the emergence. And um, I think this was from the text that are that such things are or are not to be said about man is a question we cannot determine until we have discovered what justice is. So this is in contrast to talking about the gods and how naturally advantageous to the possessor whether he seems to be just or not. So he's saying I can make statements about the gods, right? Because they're supposed to have perfection, but I cannot make statements about man because man don't follow the rules of the gods.
Yeah. The, uh, what I got from this is that the cautioning with or mimetic anything is it comes back to this identifying against type of thing, or even if you're identifying for. The thing is you're what we need to identify in is a spirit or a higher ideal, not in the instantiation of a spirit, because then it's distorted, right? So you have the first principle principle go straight to the source. And so I think that's what they're doing is they're kind of removing this intermediary thing and trying to get people to uh, don't look at the effects, don't look at the appearance, look at the source. That's where you need to look to. So they're removing appearance. Plato's removing. So if you remember the three types of goods, there's the goods in and of themselves, the goods because of their appearance, and the goods that are good for both. And right now we're trying to concentrate on goodness despite its appearance. Trying to remove all of the appearances of goodness. It actually brings them back at the end. But the reason that you so I was talking to Mark about this a couple of weeks ago or something, but like we talk about the right thing to do. Like, oh, I'm doing this right thing A, because if I don't do um, right thing, all of these other bad consequences will happen. Um, but actually, in reality, the reason you do the right thing is not consequences. You do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. So, like, there's something calling you to justice that you actually can't rationalize or justify uh, from the consequences. Like, okay, maybe we could think of an example, but okay, whatever. Like, say I'm gonna go to church this Sunday. I'm not gonna go to church this Sunday because I'll feel better afterwards, or um, I'm gonna commune with the community. I'll get to talk to my friends, or um, I'm gonna whatever have this set effect afterwards. I'm going to church on Sunday because that's the right thing to do. Because I'm participating in goodness. I'm being a just human being. So when they don't want people to, they're cautious of with the poets of people identifying in the effects of a higher ethic, and they don't want they're not wanting children to get confused with these second order effects or consequences, and I start identifying in them that way. They want to remove that intermediary thing. Um, oh, on the sorry, I'll be brief on this. So with the whole fear of death thing, that's really interesting. There, um, so I will say that. So I was I self-identified as an atheist for like 10 years or whatever because I thought that really a coping mechanism for mortality. And it wasn't till I started seeing things differently. Like, oh, this not like worrying about afterlife or anything like that. Um, Reading the stories of Jesus and the saints and stuff like that, it had a profoundly more effect on me because it's like, oh, this is all about now. Like, we're not taking consequences of after death. We're everything has meaning right now in this life. So you're not doing something out of fear of something after you die. You do it out of fear of something that will happen right now, or you're doing something because of the effects right now, or you have immediate access to goodness right now. It's not something that you'll experience sometime after you die. So, anyways, I really resonated with that. What they're doing with removing fear of death or something like that. They're they're it's bringing the telos back in again. Um,
So I don't know if they're saying this with the like with respect to teleology, or they did mention that like the simple musician and the simple like athlete, the very exercises and tolls which they undergo are intended to stimulate the spirited element of their nature. So I don't know if that's another way of saying people live out what they are. And if I don't know if that's the same thing as saying I'm going to do good because it's the good thing to do, right? Um, I mean, is there a difference of just saying, because I'm a man, let's say, I'm going to do the right thing, or I don't know, because like that's more of a bottom up approach at behavior.
Yeah, but that, like, I think that's the distinction between honor culture and relating to the transcendental, right? So honor culture is like the culture is requiring a certain role of you, right? And then you are granted your identity by society, and then who you are is in some sense how good you can live up to your role, which is actually something that they're playing around in the Republic with. But when you get your identity granted down from above, right, like through a calling, it's different, because um, what is the enforcement? Well, the enforcement in one side is dishonor, right? Like that's why it's called an honor culture. Like you lose the honor and maybe your honor of your family or whatever, right? And oh yeah, we talked about honor the other time, right? And the materialization of the spirit, right? So there's a material framing in relation to the spirit that is the enforcement, right? But you can also just have the spiritual be its own enforcement, right? And then decouple it from uh, society and its oppression and I think dealing this idea with death, right? Like I never liked that argument. Like, but in order to be free, and it's actually interesting that the guardians are there to maintain the freedom of the state, right? So there's this call to be free, and if you're identified against dying, right, because you're scared, you are not free to act, right? Like you're enslaved to that fear, right? And so there is a need to transcend that fear, right? And like you can say, well, I identify with my family's honor or something, right? And then if I if I taint my family's honor, then like I need to remove myself in order for this higher entity to persist, right? But you can also say, well, there are these principles, or there's this divine being that I participate in. It is more important to stay true to that than to lose my life, because I will lose my life if I'm not true to that. And I think they are flirting with that idea, right? Like, but this is in book 4, but they're basically saying when you're not just, you're spiritually ill, like just is in some sense the health of your spirit. And um yeah, like, and that means that you're dead, right? Because like or you're dying, because that's what being ill or being diseased is. Like you're dying, like you're not functioning properly, and you're moving away from life.
Yeah, I like that.
So instead of justice being the thermostat, I guess the question that I have in my mind is whether the honor culture and coupling with a role is necessary, because they talk about the harmonious souls being temperate and courageous, and the inharmonious would be cowardly and boorish. So in my mind, that's more of a grounding out in the individual experience. Like that, like to me, that's a way to gauge the temperature of like, you know, if your soul is not is inharmonious, you're gonna have problems, right? It's just not gonna work like functionally or something practically. And I don't know if that's dependent upon the tyranny of the state. Um, so
Why are you making that connection?
Yeah, what? I didn't follow that connection at all.
so Manuel was saying that if you take if your aims are dependent upon, like, it are informed by an honor culture, then that means your aims are going to be, I guess, very directed by some kind of top-down force, or something like that. I guess for what I see is the chapter 3. There's some kind of macrocosm. The state is a macrocosm, and then the individual is like a microcosm of similar of
Yeah. Well, that's the scaling issue that I was talking about before, right? Like
well,
book 2 sets up the scaling problem. You can't understand justice from the perspective of one or more people. You have to look at it from a city down.
okay. I So
And I think the
you
same
can't
is
start
true for your
start
role.
from you can't. So can you? Does that mean that are you limited in your ability to discern as an individual?
Yes, absolutely. That's what book 2 says clearly. That's the scaling problem. It says you can't take the scale of an individual looking across the landscape and say this person, that person, these people, and understand justice, which
And
totally makes sense in the sum total of all the people being just. It has to be, which means you're down here, here. You can't be down here and understand the thing up here. It's that simple.
you have to realize that Plato is separating society into groups, right? And he's making 3 groups, right? Like he's making the plebs, and then he's having the guardians, right? And then he's having the ruling class within the guardians, right? So these 3 groups, what are they based upon? Well, they're based upon the capacity for discernment, right? Like all the plebs, they don't have the soul that is required to be a guardian. Like these guardians have this crazy quality. What is this quality related to? And actually, I think there was a qualifier about book 3, because it was only in relation to the education of the guardians that they're
Yes.
talking. So we have to keep that in mind, right? But so what there's the spiritual attunement, right? That these guardians have, and apparently Plato thinks that allows them this different relationship, right? Like that Ethan was talking about to the ideal, right? And I think it's important to realize that that's not everybody. Like that's literally not meant for everybody, and yeah, how they're gonna do the
Yeah,
discernment, that's a separate problem. But
it's an interesting point.
Yeah, and I think the thing, right? They keep thinking that, well, the whole book is about politics. Obviously false. Stated out front. And then you can look at book 3 and say, okay, we have to throw out all the poets. But book 3 is only talking about throwing out the poets for the education of the guardians, not for everybody. And then the problem's going to come in at the end, I suspect, although I haven't read ahead, that now you have to integrate all that. So now you have a different set of problems. Even though you fixed them in each little area, now you have a different set of problems because it's not like you're going to prevent the guardians from running into the poets if they're there for other purposes. And this is where I think people get confused. Because in here, for example, he's not making a good case against poetry as such. If that were the case, like, oh, a city can't have poets in it. That's not the case in book 3 at all. And if it were, he does a terrible job.
There actually is a part where he says, if somebody visits our city that's a good poet, we'll celebrate him, as being something wonderful, and
Right,
then we'll nicely ask him to leave.
right, right. We'll get him the hell out. Right. Yeah, I thought that was funny.
I'm not sure if I can connect these dots, but
Mhm.
so the thing that they mentioned, when intemperance and disease multiply in a state, that basically increases demand for roles like doctors and lawyers. And then they
Mhm.
talk about how, like, if you're like the law nerd, like I'm top lawyer, I pride myself in litigiousness. And they say, and all for what? In order to gain small points not worth mentioning, and he not knowing that, so to order his life as to be able to do without a napping judge is far higher and nobler sort of thing. So that's like a scathing criticism of, let's say, like, this is a man who maybe at one level could be, say, like, oh, I'm occupying an honorable high office, like I'm decorating myself with achievement or something like that, right? But then he kind of, what Socrates does, he kicks the leg out under that by saying, oh well, it's all for nothing, it's actually a waste, so that's kind of why I
Right.
say, like, I'm not sure if honor's good, like binding uh glue.
No, no, but it's not. But honor's not binding glue in an honor culture. Honor's a measure, right? That's what honor culture is. It's measuring honor as the way to understand people. But the point that Socrates is making, and this I think is where everybody's confused, right? He's saying if the lawyer points at litigiousness as their goal, like, I want to be a good lawyer, then law will be destroyed by that lawyer automatically.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like if you have a class of lawyer, like if you start, I think maybe this ties back into the temperance. If you have a whole class of lawyers, it's going to destroy things. Like if you have a whole class of doctors, they're going to start. It's almost like they're going to start inventing diseases for them to cure because of their
Well, they'd
purpose is
have
to.
to, right?
Yeah.
But it's not even required to have a whole class. It's only required that they start pointing at what they're doing instead of the thing
Hmm.
that gives them the reason for what they're doing or the final
Right.
cause, right?
Exactly. So
The
you
lawyers
look
are
at something
fine
and
if they
it's.
point at justice. Like if a lawyer points at justice, all litigiousness will be just. When they point at litigiousness, all litigiousness will be litigious. It's that self-referencing problem. And
Mhm.
that's what he's pointing to. He's not pointing to anything else. Everybody who's reading into this is just reading into it.
Yeah, something that has an inner teleology, something that's pointing, like we were talking about earlier. If it's pointed inwards, you can just immediately see that it's not, no good can come from it.
Right.
So, is that what he's saying? Is he's like this temperance? Like we don't want to have too many doctors or too many
but
lawyers.
but it's not. I don't think it's about the amount of doctors, because
Yeah,
what
it's
what he
not amount.
says is he's saying that there's two vices, right? Like one is luxury, and the other one is what is it? Poorness? I don't know what the word is.
Oh,
Anyway, so he's saying you can have either too much, and if you have too much, you have to deal with excess, right? Because the excess is gonna introduce a corruption, right? If you have too little, you're gonna have to deal with the consequence of the lack, because now people are gonna enforce their own means because they have their needs not met, right? And and so you can't have either, and that's what temperance is. Well, yeah. And
Yeah,
how are you gonna do that? Like, I don't know. Like,
it's interesting. The Hebrews in their tradition, which is our tradition as well, they actually opt for excess, and they have a means of dealing with excess with the number seven Sabbath. The way that you deal with excess.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's what book three is all about: is setting up this rhetorical framing, not to make a point as such, but to set up the methodology of the points that it's going to be making further on.
Yeah. There's another interesting thing. This reminded me of what you said you said a couple weeks ago regarding affluence. If you have an increased amount of affluence, people are going to they're essentially you're gonna have a bunch of retired people doing nothing and
Right,
falling out of their roles, and then they become serious, whatever has intemperate, and so they
right.
start chasing things that are not justice. Which if you could identify some of these things in Western culture and art, when they started pursuing things that were like, I think we talked about this a little bit last night, but like the art starts to be removed from a higher good, or beauty. You talk about this a lot. Like you say, well, beauty won't save the world. I'll say something like, well, beauty starts becoming separated from the thing that
Right.
it's subordinated to.
Right. When you start pointing at beauty alone,
Mm-hmm.
right, or anything, but we'll just use beauty because you brought it up. What happens is you start to make beautiful things for the sake of beauty,
Uh huh. Yeah.
and then now you're unmoored from the truth of beauty and the goodness of beauty, right? Because it's
Mm-hmm.
pointing at itself. And that is the problem of luxury and the problem of not having proper, it's not just roles, it's proper roles. And this is why, when somebody says, "Oh, I have this stupid job," they have a point. It's just not a good one, right? It's like, well, yeah, everybody has a stupid job though, by your definition. And that's what happens when you dig into these they're all jobs are pointless. Yep, they are. And either in their implementation or in their aim, and
read
people don't realize that.
Ecclesiastes.
We're
Vanity.
talking about the Republic, Christians and your Christiany stuff.
Well,
Um,
I
no, but do you see the excess is in the ability to pursue something for its own tree is. I can
Mm-hmm.
pursue eating for the sake of eating. I can pursue going out on my boat for the sake of enjoying going out on my boat, rather than working, 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 and then going, "Oh, I'm working too hard. I need to go out of my boat." Because now you're not pursuing the one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Luxury allows you to pursue one thing to the exclusion of the other things. And then we get into this. Ooh, you know what I want? I want more beauty. I just want more beauty, right? There's the narrowing, right? And so you end up narrowing on a transcendental.
hashtag
And that's what
succubus.
luxury allows us to do.
That's funny.
That's what a succubus is actually. But keep going.
Also, because it's another narrowing. Well, then that's the thing. It's not just, is it parasitic? That's a good one, right? Does it narrow or does it broaden, right? Because if it narrows, it will become parasitic eventually, right? Or you can narrow on beauty and be lost in beauty forever.
So since we're talking about the transcendentals, I actually think I
Uh-oh.
can map that on chapter 3. Because I was talking about truth, right? Like, oh yeah, he's talking about the gods and making things true, and then we go to music, which is about
Mhm.
beauty. And then the last part is about physicality, goodness, right? And they kind of define goodness as perfection or right, like being able to fulfill your function or whatever. So I think it's pretty fair to map these three onto the chapter and say, well, in order to have a proper person, like they need to develop their relationship to these transcendentals, and then they have three aspects of effectively religion, uh, arts, and sports.
How are you mapping those to truth, goodness, and beauty?
Well, religion is dealing with truth, being true.
Oh, maybe.
Well,
I don't
that's the
know.
way that they're doing it in this chapter. Like,
Where
right?
where are you making that connection?
Well, like they're they're talking about all of this imitation, right? And like the way I read the imitation is lying, right? So we're talking
No,
these
no.
poets.
Imitation and truth could be linked. I mean, I think it's bad translation at that point, but I get the point of what you're saying. How are you linking?
Well, because they're stating it in relation to the nature of the gods, right? Like in true in the world, we need to have a true understanding of the gods, which are the source of our acting in the world.
Oh, okay. I'm I'm convinced. That's fair.
Like the only thing that I'm skeptical about, but like I'm skeptical about the use of goodness in the whole book. So like that's not new. Is that they're connecting goodness with I guess embodied practice, right? Which is
Yeah.
like maybe like
Well,
I guess
well,
the ethics
no,
is there, right? Like there's an ethic
no,
that
I think that's right. Yeah, because being is good.
yeah, I guess.
So I can't argue with that one either. No, you convinced me. That sounds like a good mapping. I didn't see any of that.
It's right there, Mark. Like,
I know. I know. Well, there's so much here. It's right.
but okay. So this was the thing that came up for me. So I'm listening to book 4, right? And so they're taking it back to the person, right? From the city back to the person, and I'm like, yeah, but like this doesn't fit for me. Like I feel
Mm.
like it's inverted. Like you wanted to get to a certain outcome in the person, and therefore you framed the city in a certain way. Like I leaving the natural sequence of the argument. Like I just don't see it. But that we'll
No.
talk about that more later.
Well, I would argue that all of book three is an unnatural sequence full of ridiculous and absurd perfection standards and incorrect statements. Like just some of this stuff is absurd. Like I said before, like this is absolutely crazy talk at some point. The way they're discussing this, right? And I understand a lot of that is the framing, right? No, this is for the Guardians. This is a specific case. Um, but they do say things like, "Well, we have to expel them from the city. Like we can't." It's like, well, that seems a little heavy-handed if you're just talking about one group.
Yeah, well, they're not talking about one group, right? Because they were also talking about myths for the whole people, right? But like they were just tiering the level of myths, and and the level of understanding required on each tier. And I don't know if it's in this book, but they're going to talk about this philosopher king, right? And this philosopher king is like the only person who's supposed to have true knowledge, right? Like everybody else is supposed to live in
Right.
a delusion.
Yeah.
Only the one person is supposed to not live in a delusion.
Well, is it a
But then,
delusion or is it an imperfection, which is a different. A delusion is a lie. An imperfection
well,
is just an incomplete.
yeah, well, yeah. Anyway, it's interesting that there's an inversion there because there's the philosopher king is not allowed to have physical relations, right? Like, so he's not allowed to have money or like that's
Right.
supposed to be
Right.
all taken care of. So there's this shifting of groundedness in the spiritual versus groundedness in the
Right. Right.
material, and
Of
actually,
course.
and I
Well,
think that's
Yeah,
what
the
kings are supposed to be, right? Like a king
no,
as
no, no, no,
such.
no, 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 no. I think that this is again, this is the deep confusion that's right here in book three. He's not making statements about how things should be. That's not here. He's making statements about the problems you'd run into with ideals. This is a you're an idealist. Here's all the problems with idealism. That's so far what the book's been about. It's been these solutions you think are solutions are not solutions because everything's connected. And so he look, I've told people this for years. You keep talking about philosopher kings without realizing that Plato himself proved philosopher kings aren't useful. Like he's explicit about it. He's so explicit about it. Me, who didn't read the damn book, knows this. And I've asked many people about it, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's right. That's right in the book that it doesn't work. You could have one once ever. And because even the person who was that good couldn't pick a successor. That's like the whole thing. He's basically saying, here's the ideal ultimate solution to the problem. It's already impractical. It's already absurd. And then he's saying, and that doesn't work because that person won't necessarily have the skill of discernment because they're up here. Yes, right. In other words, you can't fix these things. This is not a manual of how to run a society. It's a manual of what's wrong with running a society. Those are two different things.
Yeah, like I'm watching all of these series about kings and stuff, and it's like everything that goes wrong is, or not everything, but most things that go wrong are because the king is involved in the political games and the political power struggles of the lesser level, not on the
Right.
level of the king. So like I think having a
Yeah, but you
gap
can't
there
but you
somewhat.
can't but when you put the gap in, now the king can't govern. That's part of Plato's point, is that you can put the gap there, but now the king can't govern. Like, in other words, you can't get out of the connectedness of everything. That's really all this is saying, which should be obvious to absolutely everybody who ever lived, but apparently is just being ignored by everybody in recent times, we'll say.
need an Aaron.
What do we have for notes next in
Well,
going
before
on?
we
We
move
were at
past
music. Okay.
music, I guess one thing that struck me is how strongly many of their appeals are dependent upon taste. So they say things like certain harmonies express the spirit of sorrow, and we don't want certain types of people to be too sorrowful. Therefore, we have certain types of music, that create like courageousness in times of war. Or what was the other thing? I lost track of my notes. Right, but they talk about how like there's kind of an effect of certain types of musics and harmonies have certain types of effects. But what I found interesting is that they're supposedly having this like rational frame. It's sort of like what Ethan was saying about in terms of the monotheism thing. How do they know to make this objection? In a similar manner, I found it. Why is it that so much of their so supposedly rational framing is dependent upon like saying if we want to educate people with the right taste, therefore, right? And it kind of goes
Well,
under the
because that's
radar.
not, but that's not irrational. This is the problem with rationality. Rationality doesn't solve that problem and cannot solve that problem. This is why Vervicki wants to extend rationality, right? Oh, look at all the problems rationality has no chance of ever addressing. But I like rationality, so we need to make it address all these things. It's like, no, that's not how that works. The rationale for something is in the framing. And if you want to see that in action, I can recommend last night's live stream where I basically demonstrated this to solve religion by using law. And so they're there trying to, make statements about what is good and what is better and why society needs certain set of laws, right? And I was saying, where are you getting your discernment from? Which it was perfect for the topic of the stream, right? And they couldn't provide it. So they were saying, this is perfectly rational. And I said, great, show me the rationale. Like, let's step through the rationale. And they couldn't. Like, actually, you could just watch it. You could watch them and not be able to do it and not even try. And I said, no, that's a tautology. And that's because you can't do without tautology. The question is, what tautology do you pick? And I would say, and I said this on last night's stream, being is good. It's not that hard. And then when you start there, a bunch of things make more sense. In this book, right? So chapter 2 is talking about you can't get at justice by talking about people or groups of people. You need to talk about the city. Why? Because groups of people are not a city. A city is something one layer up from mere groups of people. That's not to say that groups of people aren't one layer up from individual person or one layer up from family, whatever. It's to say, in order to even start to talk about justice, we need to go one layer up. And then in book 3, all right, well, given the constraints we've already have, would you say, right? Because this is all about your personal opinion. This is another trick I suspect that Socrates is about to play, right? That's going to unfold in the course of the book. If I know my man, and I think I kind of do. What he's going to do is he's going to pull the rug out from under your personal opinion. But right now, he's just appealing personal opinion. Would you agree that? Would you say that? Don't you think that? Right? It's all about getting the opponent to acquiesce to something that is within the range of the point that Socrates is trying to make, right? And look, it's a fun game. I've played it many times. Um, but that's the key is that he's not trying to make claims of objective truth, beauty, goodness, justice, etc. He's not in that game. He's actually in what I would call the scientific game or the philosophic game is probably more accurate, right? Which is to say the intersubjective agreement that allows us to cooperate dictates what the city should look like, which is necessarily true, right? But he's going to cast that as a bunch of perfect systems and then show you why they're not perfect, ending with the philosopher king, right? Or maybe that's not how it ends. I haven't read ahead yet. So the trick, that's the whole course of the Socratic method, like in a box. That's the whole thing. It
Right. And so the intersubjective agreement is, if that's important, we tend to fly by things that are like in the music section they talk about affinity to wantonness is bad, intemperance is bad, and then that leads you to love and beauty. And like usually even in talking with in the modern day, there's like people just don't ever push back on those terms. When you're in a rationalist frame, then people get to the what do you mean by that and type of stuff. But in our egalitarian culture, I think a lot of the times, if there's not much talk on aesthetics, love, taste. I don't know how to open
No,
that.
because
Go ahead.
no, because you can't. Like this is the whole point that Paul Vanderklay makes left, right, and center. So he ripped apart the talk between Jordan Peterson and Lawrence Krauss, right? And he said, listen to what Lawrence Krauss is saying. He's using these words that aren't rational words. They're not logical. They're not reasoned words, right? They're feeling words. They're emotion words. And then he's building his physics or his scientific argument on top of that. Okay. And what Vanderklay is trying to explain to hopefully everybody is that that's what everyone does. Purely scientific argument that doesn't exist. You can't rationalize your way into truth, beauty, and goodness, or to love, or to any. Doesn't have the ability to do anything in that space. It, those tools are useless for the most important aspects of life. And so, what people are doing is you start from axioms and then you proceed with your rational behavior or your rationality or whatever. You have to, you don't have a choice. The problem is that first move is religion, always. Like that, you can't avoid that problem. You have to have a highest value to pursue a rational frame. It doesn't work otherwise. The rationality just breaks down. And again, if you want to see that, last night's live stream was a good example. They were trying to rationalize their way into something that they didn't have a frame for. And when you don't have a frame, you can't invoke rationality. And they tried and tried and tried, and they couldn't do it. Like they just couldn't even go there. It was kind of hysterical. I mean, I thought it was hysterical, but then I have weird tastes.
The the music section, I always kind of just gloss over it because I get like it's hard for me to understand. Like I can't like it's a part of their culture that we just don't have. Like I don't. It's like, well, we need this mode. We don't need this mode. But yeah, I guess you get the point that we're they're speaking to. Um, did you call it tastes? I don't know if I would use that word, but higher ideals. Like we
No,
want to direct
no,
people.
they're talking about spirits, right? They're,
Yeah.
they're
Right.
saying when you do music, you summon a spirit,
Yep.
and you only want to summon certain spirits. That's
Oh, you
that's the
could,
argument.
Ethan, the way
Yeah.
to look at this in modern times is the pushback against pop music. It It's literally the case he's making.
Yeah.
He's saying there's certain types of music that are dangerous. And I mean, I'm a big fan of good pop music, but like most pop music is total garbage and should be expunged from the planet. So, like, I'm right there with Socrates.
Yeah. It's actually
I
kind of
actually
terrifying.
did a recording with Bruce this week, and I'm gonna release it on Monday. And like we talked about that, and he was like, "Yeah, maybe I'm not fully upholding my Christian values when I engage with these things." So
Yeah.
yeah, that
No,
that was the insight he had.
it's actually kind of terrifying because when you think you live in a dead objective world, there's like, of course, everything's just dead material. It's like, of course, this kind of music isn't gonna summon any spirits. It's like there's no such thing as summoning bad
Right.
spirits. And then, okay, so last week, I went to the symphony, and the symphony is actually nicknamed Tragic. And I was the program notes how Mahler's wife, it was Mahler's Sixth Symphony, was reading this music, and there were themes of death of children, right? And she's like, she was critical of him doing that. It's like you can't write music about that. And um, a couple years later, one of his children actually ended up dying, and um, his response was like, well, composers have what they're doing is they actually have a deep connection to the world, and it was more or less a prophecy than an invocation, which
Right.
is an interesting thing to say. But um, yeah, hopefully, well, my wife's pregnant, so baby definitely heard it, and she said he was active the whole time. So I don't know if I don't. It's kind of frightening. So for better or for worse, we'll see. Well, maybe we won't see. It's not something you can measure, but
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that is it. Like, there is a spirit, and that's what this is pointing to, is that people can be taken over by these spirits of
mm,
music in particular, right? That's the most obvious example. Like, it's hard for people to deny that humans are possessed by music in some by some definition of possession. Like, I'd like to
mm.
see somebody make the counter argument there.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
think you can.
think of like the punk rock culture, right? I mean, music is definitely linked to a particular kind of. That's probably not a good word. It's definitely linked to a kind of. You don't see them
No,
having
it
tea time.
well, that's what different musical genres are supposed to represent,
Mhm.
is the spirit that they're invoking, right? And so speed metal invokes a certain spirit, spirit I happen to like. Uh, but, there's a spirit there for sure, right? It's high tempo, high speed music, right? I used to use it to get work done, and I would get a crap ton of work done when I was listening to Metallica or Tool or something, right? And, you know, eventually maybe you can't do that anymore, or you shouldn't do that anymore, right? You shouldn't try to move at that pace, right? And or as opposed to Beethoven's Sixth, which is obviously the best piece of music ever, but in any genre. So that
That's
that has a
weird.
different spirit, right?
That's
The
totally
the
weird. It just reminded me a couple of weeks ago. I was listening to Mozart actually in the garage, and I was trying to get work done. I couldn't. It crippled me. I could get work done, but when I was listening to the Mahler, I just was zipped through everything.
Yeah,
It was
right,
really
right.
weird.
Well, there's an alignment. Like, there's certain things I almost never do this, but there are certain things I can do while I listen to Beethoven's Sixth. But usually when I'm listening to Beethoven's Sixth, I'm in a bath of water, or I'm driving somewhere, that I know I can listen to the whole thing, and I'm on straight roads or something. I'm on like a highway. Uh, I'm listening to it to relax. I'm almost never listening to it to work. There are times when I do that, but it is important. And yeah, the composer is a prophet who's talking about these spirits. Now, if you prophesy something, does it come true, or are you prophesizing things so they don't come true? Or is prophecy something else? And like, I got nothing, right? But there's a point to the spirit of the music that is being talked about in book three, where, well, yeah, we have to ban this because of the danger of it possessing people. And I think if you watch the Anadromist YouTube channel, Burn Powers, one of Burn Powers' YouTube channels, the How We Got Here series is all about that. He's following the spirit of music and how it leaks in or impacts the culture, however you want to think about it. Um, and these cycles, the roughly 10-year cycles, that happen, right? And so there's something to that. I mean, it's here in book three. It's also in How We Got Here by the Anadromist. Like, everybody's seeing it throughout time. You can pick any point in time and they'll talk about the dangerous new music, right? They'll talk about the right music, or no music if they're aesthetics. Um, this is a perennial issue.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
another thing that I found interesting is that the concept of a style introduces a temporal element because they mention that there's a correspondence between music and a style, but styles change over time, which is why we can't just snapshot Beethoven six and say freeze it for forever and say, yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing and great, but over time you do have to adapt to the modern your context, and that changes over time. So
Yeah.
we can't just
Yeah. Well, we don't.
we can't even take their frame of saying, well, we need to censor the following harmonies, and like maybe we only want to have
Right.
the Phigerian mode patterns and the Dorian mode patterns for our society. You
Right.
can't even do that because of the concept of style. Like it
But
changes over
Danny,
time.
I don't. I've never heard Beethoven's Sixth. Beethoven was dead when I was born. I'm
Mhm.
not that old. Right. I've never heard Beethoven 6 ever. No one has. Not anyone alive, right? So what have I heard? Well, look, I'll fight for the blue label all day long. Uh, right. And I actually despise most of the other renditions of Beethoven 6. I'm super picky because I'm detail oriented. So the tempo has to be right. Everything has to be spot on, or I'm not down with it. And a lot of people speed up the beginning and right. So there's all these little nuances. So yeah, and that is but what is that? I would argue that's the revivification that Jordan Peterson talks about. You have to revivify these things, right? And so the style has to be revivified in some sense because things are moving. And that
So
that is gonna end up being the key problem in everything, is that things are always moving. Solid answer.
Mhm.
so I want to drag it into something else because the thing that I ended up talking about with Bruce is he said I segregate, right? Like sometimes I listen to the music and I don't listen to the text. And the thing that I have to say is like, well, but like, do you think that's good? Like segregating your mind, like you think so there's this aspect where it's like I can deal with that, but like I don't think that's the question. Right? Like yes, you can deal with things, but should you? Right? Like that is the question. If we're pointing at the ideal, right? Like what is the relationship I should have, not what is the relationship that I can have. And I think that's kind of
Yeah.
what they're exploring, right? Like what is the relationship that you should have, right? And then yeah, it's like, well, yeah, if you're gonna do all these things, then you're gonna end up with a messy situation when you start implementing, because like you obviously can't. And I think that's the issue, right? Like you start pushing on this side of the equation, and then something else on the other side pops up.
Yeah, you were kind of choppy there for a while, Manuel. Get bad bandwidth. But now your camera looks better too, so maybe your bandwidth is back online. Yeah, I how do you address this?
Can we summarize what you just said? Because he roboted heavily. Um,
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do it again. Am I good now?
yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's this idea that you're when you separate things, right? It's like I'm not watching at this aspect of reality, for example, in a song. Like I'm listening, not listening to the text. I'm just here to swing on the rhythm or whatever, right? But now you're changing yourself into a person that is tuning out the text, and
Mm,
like that's not good. like
mm.
like you're not
Can
supposed to
you?
be that person. And
Well,
and
then
can you even do
can you?
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, like you can you think you can do that, but like what is the spirit? But like is the spirit only relating to the things that you're aware of, or is this actually something that's resonating inside of you and you can just look away from what it's resonating with and still have the effects of the resonance?
Well, and also, are you sure that you can filter the unconscious signals coming from the music in the form of the speech? And when I, for example, nowadays listen to music from way back or whatever, I'm like, oh, I didn't understand at the time how significant these lyrics were. So if you want the meaning crisis, for example, you can go listen to some of the rock operas from back in the day. Listen to Styx, Mr. Roboto, and you can hear it right in that song, right? Whole albums like that because it's the same thing, right? They're talking about the same thing throughout because it's an opera. It's an actual opera. Um, and that's the issue, is it can you really filter that out, or do you feel that irrespective of how consciously I would argue that the unconscious signaling is way more significant. It sways you way more than anything conscious can. By definition, if it's conscious, you can rationalize it. And so you have that yoke of rationality on it. With unconscious things, there's no rationality in the unconscious by definition. Those things are moving you, period. End of statement. Um, maybe your emotions mitigates them, but you don't have the extra tool of your rationality to mitigate them.
And that actually makes me think about this idea that I think in Orthodox Christianity, your house needs to be blessed every year, right? So there's this sanctification of your space, right, where effectively you're casting away this evil spirit, right? And it's like, well, yeah, like if there is this place, right, which has a history or whatever, like how much are you affected by that history, right? And like what is required for you to be able to live there without uh, succumbing to that influence? And yeah, that's some really interesting questions, right? Like are these that live there, right, or are grounded in a physicality? Because when you go into a holy site, right, like I'm now thinking of the temple of Amritsar, right, like Golden Temple of the Sikhs, right, and then everybody walks in a circle around it, right, and there's this lake. There's definitely a specific spirit that is there, right, and not far away from that, there's this place where the British soldiers like shot like a bunch of Indian protesters. I think that was during Gandhi's thing, and that like escalated the whole interaction between the British and the Indians. And so, but that that place also has a spirit, like, and it's really distinct from the spirit, which is only like half a mile away, and they're both there, right? And in some sense, people want to keep it there, right? Like they actually spend effort to maintain that spirit in that location. Um, and I guess that's what making it sacred is, right? Like the one part is made sacred because it has a religious context, and the other one is made sacred because it has a somewhat political but also historical significance.
Danny, did you the music?
Sorry, you roboted. Did I what the music?
Did you follow the point about the music?
Did I follow the point about the music? Um, I mean, there's, I mean, it's music is a way for us to train faculties. That's very clear, I think, in the text. Um, but I don't think that's a secret. I don't know if that's the main point.
No, I mean they were excluding music on certain grounds.
Right.
This bothers the musician for some reason. Who would have seen that coming?
Uh, I mean, it's clear that you can't do that on grounds that this is all. I mean, this is all a rhetorical exploration. You know, we're not arguing for any one point. So, I mean, yeah, you can't. You can't. I mean, but that's without. Doesn't even need to be said. Um, to me, this the whole thing about the music section is kind of like we started with the poetry thing, and then it's we're leading into music, which is ironic because it's like it's saying like the only way to explore this is like by doing it or like by I don't know how to put it into words exactly. um it's like it's I don't know how to respond to that question. I guess no. I guess the answer is no. I
Yeah, I
guess.
think I think there's a deliberate structure to the book. The poetry and then the music and then right. There's progression here that seems rather is not a piece of prose in the classic sense. It's more of a what can we learn about justice textbook done in narrative form.
I mean, I see patterns, and my eyes are mostly looking towards the excellence of the soul, and I'm mostly concerned with the individual. And I see patterns in the ordering of the way that they want to of their process of education. Like you start with an image of God, and then that informs a bunch of stuff downstream. And you can't really start with rationality and get anywhere useful. That frame is very clear. Now, the reason there's a ton of stuff that I love in this text that resonates with me at a personal level, which I haven't really mentioned any of. Right. So those are kind of more of the details of, especially when they have these like scathing comments about like, say, having a career in law, or over indexing on the gym, or being too much music. Right. A lot of that like I relate to on a personal level on all kinds of stuff. But I don't know that they're trying to make a point about music. It seems to be an intertwined necessary part of life. Like,
Well, it's not a point about music. It's a like they're making the same set of points about everything. If you want a book about patterns, I yeah, some patterns everywhere. Like he's just trying to exemplify the same problem over and over again by putting it in different contexts. That's so far. I mean, maybe that'll change, but
Yeah, but but I think it's also pointing at a different nature, right? So we're getting to the harmony and tunement, right? So it's also building a metaphor to talk about things, right? So
right.
I think the harmony part is uh, is related to temperance. Like I think the temperance isn't so and the truth part is related to wisdom because I'm using a framing that will come in the next chapter. So they're talking about the four virtues, right? And so the wisdom, temperance, what was the other one? And justice. Oh,
beauty.
courage,
Oh,
courage, right? And so courage is going to come with the physicality, right? Like so, courage is I had a definition that here is courage is knowledge of what really is. That was a definition that that I got from a comment on the text,
hmm.
right? So there's 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 the way that you're affected, right? Like okay, like there and this goes into stoicism, right? There's this idea that when things happen, right, like either you can affect them or they're just happening. And I think that's what they're talking about when there's like what is really is, right? Like what are the things that you have agency over and what are the things that you don't have agency over, and that allows you to go in straight and ignore the fact that you're gonna die, for example, right? Because you're already fated to die, and then you can choose the way that you die instead of whether you have to choose whether you're gonna die or not, right? And and I think that's the thing, the basis for courage, right? So I think what they're also setting up is they're setting up these three virtues, which are apparently, in my mind, relating to these three transcendentals, and then they're effectively saying that justice is something that is outside or above these three virtues, and or within them or whatever. So there's justice is the thing that connects the other virtues and puts them in right relationship. But I'm getting ahead of it. But I guess I'm now starting to see what book three is about.
Well, that's great. Victory. Yeah, I think this. I like your term, Danny. Over it, and you pay attention to just the one thing, whether it's the gym or the legal system or your role, right? It doesn't matter. That's where the corruption is, which is not a treaty against expertise. It's just to say you can't pay attention to the one thing. So what do you want? You want a well-rounded lawyer. You want one that knows how to sail, or you know, goes to the symphony, right? Or both, right? And it's that well-roundedness, even though the availability for the law will be less, right? Because he's spending some of his time out on the boat and some of his time at the symphony instead of working on the cases. It's better for justice. It may not be better
Hmm.
for him, it may not be better for you, but it's better for justice. It's like, oh, so there's all these trade-offs and sacrifices that we have to make to engage with things like justice, or
Yeah,
things of the nature of justice might be the better way to say it.
yeah, and so I kind of have, well, a couple problems there, right? Because they keep saying, well, you're supposed to be the best lawyer, right? And like I agree that in order to be a good lawyer, you need to have this broad grounding. Um, so that there seems to be an inherent contradiction because like now you have this problem with like how much do you open up
No,
versus.
but I don't, no, I don't. The whole point of saying if your goal is to be a good litigator, you will destroy the law is that point. It's the same point. Yeah, you can't focus on only litigation to make a good lawyer. You can't do it. It won't work. It will corrupt instantaneously.
Yeah, but it doesn't give you a path forward, right? Like,
No, it's not supposed. That's the whole point.
okay,
The
yeah,
whole
but
point of the
that
book is
well
it's
that is that
hard.
is that is a problem, right? And
No,
then if we
he's not
go to this,
solving a problem. He's exemplifying the problems. He's not. That's this is what people are confused about. This book is not about solving any problems. It's not. It's about re-enchanting the world and saying, "Look how hard it is." Let's just take something simple like justice. That everybody, when they hear it, I know what justice is right away. I know what's just in. Okay, maybe I don't know what justice is, but I know what's just in every situation. Do you? Do you? Because you don't. You don't. It's hard. It's way too hard for you. And that's why you have to deal with things that seem unjust to you because A, they might not be, because what the hell do you know? And B, it doesn't matter because you can't implement perfect justice. So now you have to accept those facts. It's not trying to resolve the problem of justice in the same way that people mistake it for resolving the problem of politics. It's not resolving any problems, and it's certainly not talking about politics.
Uh, awakening to as opposed to awakening from type of deal.
Exactly. It's not a awakening to justice, right? It's an awakening from justice.
yeah, I don't know. Like there's, I don't know. I just have this problem with this teleological profession stuff. Whatever. Danny, I think you want to take us to the part where we do the physical stuff.
So I guess we got to go through art. I guess art first. Um, so I
Okay, yeah.
so I think after the music piece, they get into the art piece. Let's see
Mhm.
what do I have there. I only have one note there, which is a quote. Maybe it's just something I found idiosyncratically interesting. Uh, I guess I'll just read it because I don't even know what my notes say. We would not have our guardians grow up amid images of moral deformity. This is my interpretation. That was a quote. No, because that'll corrupt their soul, basically. Let our artists rather be those who are gifted to discern the true nature of the beautiful and graceful. Then will our youth dwell in the land of health amid far sights and sounds, and receive the good in everything, and beauty, the effluence of fair works, shall flow into the eye and ear like a health-giving breeze from a purer region, and insensibly draw the soul from earnest years into likeness in sympathy with the beauty of reason. I guess the rest of that was just kind of a poetic, flowery picture of, you know, um, I mean, it was artistic. It's just a kind of painting this picture, but I guess I get, but basically, they're talking about how they want to censor the moral, like images of moral deformity, so that it doesn't corrupt the soul of their youth. And so that kind of is related to the idea images. It introduces the concept of images, as well as imitation. guess we can pause there. I don't know if we want to get into that. What do you guys think?
I've gotta prepare for my next book club here soon, so I might have to leave a little early.
Okay, it is 10:50. If we want, we can maybe kind of start to wind down the next 15 minutes. Um,
Sure, we can. Yeah,
Yeah, I think the pattern is established in all three of these formulas, right? That he's laying out, right? So the physical is the only one that we didn't really talk about at all. But I'm not sure the pattern's any different from music and art.
yeah, I guess I don't know either if there's a difference between sight and sound, right? That was the only I mean that was the only question that I had is there a difference between the sound and or an image in terms of how they're using the illustration, and I don't know.
well,
I,
I
I don't
think
think
they're
there's
both
any.
pointing right, and I think that's what you have to look at. Right? Okay, like there's ways that we manifest beauty, manifesting beauty, like poetry is manifesting truth, and and there's all of these other arts that manifest beauty, and in some sense, right? Like, because what was it? Yeah, like you have artisans, right? Like this doing your job well, right, or your craft well is also an art, right? So like that, in some sense, the beauty aspect is necessarily in the perfection or your following of one calling. Like you will necessarily end up in beauty, I think. Um, yeah, I think we can wind down. I think next week we want to also talk a little bit about narrative and narration because I think we kind of skipped over the way that it was used.
Yeah, he does. He does touch on that. I found that interesting.
Um, yeah, so let's just call it. Have a reflection on the things that were salient to you during the talk and how they're gonna apply to your week. Um, yeah, and I hope to see everybody again next week. Hmm. So I was thinking about this sequence, right, where it's like truth is like the grounding, and then the beauty is like creating affordances or uh, imbuing you with spirit, and then you have the participation where you you find the expression, you find yourself within that. Like I think that's the path that is implied.
I'd put goodness at the grounding. Truth is motion, too, so it can't be grounding. But if you ground in being as good, then a lot of problems go away. Just saying. The beauty is the affordance.
Oh, interesting. The means unto goodness.
Yeah, I well maybe it's just this is what education is supposed to be, and then at a certain point you
Well,
flip it or
if you
something.
but if you focus on truth as an object, then you're going to corrupt everything, and this is the whole modern problem. Like, oh,
No,
there's definitely an objective truth.
but the truth is the patterns which the myth provides, right?
No,
It's
no, no. This the truth is the problem. Okay, it's not truth. It's the true. It's an action. It's how close you are to the thing. It's the arrow. It's not the target. Truth is a target. True is not a target. True friendship is not a goal that like I've got a true friendship. Yay! No. That's where the problem is. We keep objectifying things actually and screwing up the world.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, but if you don't have the category of friendship, I don't think you can live that out properly.
Yeah, you can have the category without truth or true, right? You could, but you have to be
Mm,
true to a friendship or you don't have a friendship. So you can't put truth because truth is static and friendship is not static. It is this calcifying of the true into truth that is it's absolutely detrimental to everything. Oh, I want to have the truth. I want the truth of the there's no truth in the situation. It doesn't exist. You could be true to the spirit of your friendship.
All right, guys. Thank you.
All right,
See,
see
Ethan,
you then.
good to see you as
See ya.
always.
so yeah,
Great, great